we'll have a very interesting chat today and some great information from our panelists. So to kind of introduce everything today, I'm going to have Tim Beckley, who's the CEO of Idealliance, introduce himself and he can speak and introduce what we're doing here.
Yeah, thank you everybody for joining today's BrandQ webinar. Thank you for all the panelists and Ron. Today's a great subject, and the timing is wonderful based upon conversations that have occurred, from some travelers and a recent board meeting that we had this week. Just got back from a trip in Vietnam, which is a tremendously rapidly growing market in packaging, booming actually, and a lot of technology coming about there, and we have a lot of customers over there. And then we had a board meeting this week as well, and one of the things in discussion was a lot of misinformation kind of floating around the industry, around the world about technology. And this is what's so great. Ron and I talk every day about information and certainly technology and capacity. And one of the things was machine capability and the fact that this technology
I don't know that I can.
Certainly coming into the industry, but it's certainly not displacing the technology that currently exists in the industry today, because when you go travel the world and you look at these magnificent facilities, there's huge amounts of technologies, from gravure presses, offset presses, flexo presses that are being utilized, and there's augmenting that digital technology. And the question was, is there a need for shared neutral appearance in the world of future of digital packaging? The answer is absolutely and immensely. And so this topic really was great timing wise. We happen to have 3 massive brands on our board. One of them is the largest company in the world, and this was a great topic to discuss. So with that, I'll pass it over to Ron, and he can make the introductions. So thank you.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Tim. And good information. You're always talking and hearing with those brands what they're looking for and what they're interested in. So I'm a consultant. I work with brands, with printers, and with Idealliance and with other people who are trying to learn about these type of topics. I'm also chair of Print Properties, and that's a Idealliance think tank that works on standards and helpful tools and applications for people to use. And I'm a trainer for G7 and BrandQ. So I'll be doing a short presentation, but really it's our 2 panelists who are going to be doing most of the talking here today. At the end of this, we're going to have a little bit of a Q&A session where you can ask any questions you have. And as Steve Ballinger said, you can shoot those in through your chat. We'll collect those all, and then we'll ask the panelists those questions. Our first panelist today will be Andy Bullock from Bullock Graphics, and he works with some of the largest brands in the world. He's a pre-media and print expert, and when I say works with, it means he helps them design their files, send their files out, builds their print quality programs. So he's got quite a bit of experience with this, with some super ginormous brands. He's under NDA, so I can't just lay their names out, but what he'll talk about generally are things that the biggest brands in the world are going through. After that, we'll have Mike Todrick from IWCO Direct, and he is a color specialist and G7 expert many times over, and a great presenter. If you ever get the chance to see him present anywhere, he gives great presentations and great information as well. So our agenda today, I'm going to give a super quick guide to shared neutral appearance. Just a very quick snapshot of what it is and why I think it's an important topic. And a lot of people I know who know a lot about color and do a lot in this field aren't really aware of it or don't really know the implications of shared neutral appearance. That's why we're covering it. Next, we'll have Andy Bullock talk, and he'll give an analytical overview. He is a deep thinker. He thinks about all this stuff. So he's going to talk about that and, what he's sort of the conclusions he's come to about it. Then Mike will talk, and he's going to talk about across the machines and the enterprise and what they do with shared neutral appearance and the impact it has with them. After that, we'll have a quick Q&A session. And you can ask any questions you have, and that'll kind of give you a chance to ask the questions that are, not addressed or maybe a little bit harder. Before we do that, this is sponsored by BrandQ, which is Idealliance program for brands. We have three main things we do with BrandQ. We communicate, educate, and validate. This is a picture of a BrandQ training class. You can see these are a bunch of designers and print buyers. They have sheets in front of them. They're measuring, learning the language of color, learning how to communicate with the supply chain. Communicate, you can see in here, there are a bunch of brands in the same class talking about color issues and looking at the proof and the press sheet they have there and what could be different and what could cause those. So learning how to communicate with the printer what they want and what they need. And then validate, and that's learning how to measure and check and how to understand quality control and process control. So these are three of the main elements. We have a training program. We have a certification program. We actually do certification for some quite large brands where we're actually having the Idealliance labs audit the sheets and get their printers qualified, or we teach you how to do that yourself. So a great program. We have classes around the world. The next one is in Taiwan in July. But you can get more information on that at the Idealliance website. So I'm going to talk for just a minute about shared neutral appearance and why it matters. And as I mentioned, I'm going to do this little bitty, teeny tiny 5-minute version. And then we'll get into Andy and Mike. So if we look at it, the first thing that is related to shared neutral appearance is part of the G7 formula. So when Don Hutchison came up with G7 and built it, he was really thinking about litho and offset. But part of this formula is something that actually works on any type of device, and that was kind of the happy accident that came out of G7. So taking a look at it, G7 defines gray balance. That means any device we print on, we have a way to calculate what that gray should be, and it's based on the color of the substrate. That's a little bit of G7 basic info. The second part of G7 basics is tonality. And if you take a look at it right here, on the screen here, you can see this little line, and this is how the G7 curve gets built. Most printing falls somewhere in here where you see my little mouse moving. That's where most standard printing is. That is the weight of the printing or tonality. And basically you can see there's this formula that is pretty much identical in the highlight, and it's identical on most devices, you can see up here, in the midtone and shadow. And that is what gives us a big part of the shared neutral appearance. So from that formula, we can print on any device in the world, any device that we calibrate, and the midtones and the highlights are pretty much going to look the same. So I'm going to show an example of that, but that is that big idea. No matter what we do, we have gray balance, and then we have this tonality that means no matter what device we go on, we have similar weight and similar gray balance. This gives us shared neutral appearance. What is shared neutral appearance? That's the idea that no matter how I print, I'm going to have something that looks similar. So you can see in here, this is an image. It shows the different print conditions that people commonly use. And of course, there's others besides these, but these are the most common. Number 6 is grackle. Number 5 is swap. Number 3 is uncoated. So if you were to look between these, they're completely different substrates, completely different types of printing. But the idea being that the neutrals look the same, the weight and the tonality looks the same. And I could take this image and I could move this image to this print process, and I'd have this result, and it would relate to the other printing process. So shared neutral appearance, if we think about it and why it matters because we can print all over the world on many different types of machines and have an end result that relates to another similar product. So this goes from newsprint, which is really cruddy, not that newsprint is cruddy, but the paper is, all the way up into higher end papers and printing. And if you look in here, color is mostly the same, gray balance is the same, the tonality and weight is about the same. What's really different is the gamut or the color volume of the device based on the paper and the ink. But we have this common theme between all of these. We don't have to separate to different profiles. These are all the same. So if we were to look at Fogra, Fogra has 55 different profiles. really in the world of G7, we can take one piece of artwork and we can use it in any of these different print methods and get something that's similar. So pretty big impact of that. And that's in a picture, that's what shared neutral appearance is. It means that I can print anywhere and get something that looks similar. The differences I'm seeing here are saturation. And if I flip back, these differences, these differences are up here because these devices have different gamuts. But in the highlight and the midtone, very similar looking. So that is the idea of shared neutral appearance. Shared neutral appearance has a couple of different things that are really, really important. And the first one is that on a pre-media and a supply chain, it means that you can have one, potentially have one file. And I'm going to show a scenario here. So the scenario that I'm going to show, if I take this, there's the old way of doing things. Imagine that I have a piece of artwork. This is my little piece of artwork. And then if I took it, imagine I've got like a 3 flexo printers. Maybe I've got like 5 offset printers. I've got maybe, 3 or 4 display printers. And then maybe I have gravure, like 2 gravure printers. So in the old way of doing things and the way that a lot of the world still does it, they would actually separate all these files for these printers. And so if I looked at this particular workflow right here in the old-fashioned way of doing it, so I could have 8, 9, 10, 13 different versions of the artwork. That's for one product. Imagine if I have 900 products times 13, that's how many individual pieces of artwork I would have. If I was to take the same thing in the world of shared neutral appearance in G7, I have my artwork, I have my 5 different litho printers, I have my 3 different flexo printers, got my wide format guys, I have my gravure, all these things that I'm printing. If I take a look at it, I have one piece of artwork. So here I had 13 pieces of artwork that I had to manage. And guess what? If this piece of artwork for this guy gets sent to this guy, I get a disaster. Over here, everybody gets the same thing. All these presses are always calibrating to the same aim. And basically, I can take a piece of artwork and interchange it and move it around from one spot to another spot without having to make a new piece of artwork or getting a pre-media penalty or anything like that. So that's kind of the magic of G7. One piece of artwork instead of 13, and move it all around, get similar results, and that's what we're talking about. So let me just flip back. Okay, the limitation of that, of course, has to do with precision. Because if you're printing, anybody doing a lot of packaging probably knows if you use different media or different substrates, you end up with a different result. So you get the similar result within the limitations of the gamut and substrate, which means if I flip back, you look here, number 6 and number 3 are not perfect matches, but they relate to each other. They're quite close. But in extreme high-end packaging, sometimes that's not close enough and we'd have to do other stuff to it. Why does it matter? And this is sort of my closing spot here. Printing and brand printing happens all over the world. And this is a method you can take all over the world to many different machines, printing methods, and get the same result and get very similar appearance, within the limitations of what I talked about with the machine. And it's supported all over the world. So from that, I'm going to have Andy speak. So Steve, if you can hand it over to Andy, and he'll talk about his thoughts about it, and then after that, Mike will talk.
Sounds good. I just handed the controls to Andy. Andy, are you there?
Hi, I'm sorry, I was on mute.
Okay, great.
I'm going to contradict Ron for just a second. Bullet Graphics was a previous entity that I used to do, and as of late last year, we formed this new company called Spanner. And so, Ron, to your point, this is kind of one of the fun things that we work with is the idea of all of our branding that we did for our company was based on ISO primaries and playing with it from kind of the printing nerd perspective, but not something we're really here to talk about today. We're going to talk about shared neutral appearance. And so for using G7, you can achieve shared neutral appearance across your whole supply chain by aligning to the same target. It's one of those things that when we talk about it with clients, it's really hard to digest. And it comes back to a few things. What does it really matter to you? That you have one target, you have simplified workflows, potentially you have one file that only needs to align to one thing. And all of this is based on the weight point of the substrate. So there is some differences across the supply chain, but for the most part, we're targeting the same thing. From and I should ask Ron and Steve, are you seeing my screen?
Yeah, you're doing good. You sound clear, and screens are showing correctly.
Perfect. So from a brand's perspective, what this does is it helps shared neutral appearance allows the brand to maintain control. And what's important about that is that knowing what you're providing to the supply chain is not open for interpretation. From a designer's perspective, they ultimately want their creation to be produced as envisioned. So if we work within the correct constraints with them and then they provide that file outwards, it allows them to see what can be achieved and it also alerts them when to ask for more. So in the case of when something's out of gamut and they need to add a spot color or a fifth color or a sixth color, this is a place where that helps as well. And from the printer's perspective, more consistently produce expected results. This is about saving time and money. The way that we kind of think about it is probably more from a project management standpoint. So if you think about the traditional 80-20 rule of project management, that shared neutral appearance helps on 80% of the time and sometimes more. And then one of the evaluations we like to consider based on that is that remaining 20% of the time actually worthwhile, or does it require extra work, and how does that influence the rest of the business that we're doing? So got some examples of clients. So client number one, they do everything as a substrate-dependent Grackle 2013 worldwide. One file, they defined each step and know what to expect. They hold a very tight tolerance, and they receive that tight tolerance from their supply chain. Client number two is Grackle 2006 in North America and regional profiles elsewhere. We have one file and one printed target become a handful of regional files and targets. Number three, they design for optimal on-screen impact. So their initial look at things is RGB only. The CMYK versions and subsequent prints are always a disappointment. Each vendor in their supply chain manipulates and optimizes to show their abilities the best. And what we end up with is not just dozens of images, but dozens and dozens of unique files. So from the brand perspective, we'd like them to work with the supply chain to identify their target being the white point in the profile, and design towards the target, clearly communicate how to achieve the target. From the design perspective, we really work with them to say design is an extension of the brand. You really need to start within the correct profile and color settings, work to stay within gamut, target a specific substrate bearing in mind any coatings that are required and how those will affect the final print. Once design is locked, we want people to soft proof on screen using substrates-dependent profiles, print a proof to confirm output, and ultimately print using substrate-dependent profiles that paints in the paper white. One of the things that the question you need to ask yourself in our examples, we work with very picky brands. So they want to know that red is that exact red. They want to know that orange is that specific orange, or that blue is that specific blue. Where shared neutral appearance allows you to be sometimes more flexible. You can also use it to be very specific. For print producers, we want them to do their due diligence. We want to consider how coatings and finish will affect the finished color, and understand that color consistency is a quality issue. This is one of those spots that sometimes is hard to grasp as well, is that color, in the same way that a die line that doesn't fold correctly or a glue tab that doesn't hold, color has that same kind of level of quality. So when you're working outside of G7, when files are shared with regions or vendors who do not utilize shared neutral appearance, we often do a lot of research and work to develop workflows to ensure that we understand what the possibilities are for the substrates and gamuts that those regions work with. And often, when you're talking about litho, the print condition or the substrate and gamut is close enough to Grackle that you will actually get similar results. The moment where this changes and where shared neutral appearance really does help more is you step outside of litho. So let's say you work with a company that does packaging and events, or packaging and product development, or packaging and a lot of outdoor advertising. We can have things that look similar across those different output channels. Then this really tends to help us. And my slides, unfortunately, aren't working at how I would like. But so one of the questions that we were asking is with substrates, targeting substrate white point based on imagery. So in the case of the image in the center here, we want to print this. But let's say our substrate is gray. It's this gray here. We sometimes need to target our paper choice based on what we want to achieve. So if I need white in the center of this gray substrate won't work. I need something over here like this. And then our second question is when a color that is required is out of gamut. So in our bottom here, these two purples, this violet is something that can't be reproduced within CMYK. So it ends up looking like this one over here. So this ends up becoming a spot color. Or it becomes this, or it becomes a different color entirely. This requires good communication with the supply chain, both from the printer's perspective, communicating to the client or to design as to what is possible, and then design communicating to the print provider to say this is what we want or this is what we need. Also understanding the limitations of the print process, and I realize I'm showing a Pantone image on the right-hand side. The reference from this was that we had a client that gave us CMYK builds for a particular Pantone color equivalent, and when they were trying to produce them, they were using an HP latex machine that the yellow ink is a little bit different than traditional offset. And so when they added, they're trying to achieve the Pantone 115, they added a little bit of magenta, and in the moment they did that, things turned to this kind of tan as opposed to what they were expecting in the bottom. So understanding the limitation of the printing process and substrates can be really important, because when it cannot match other print process of substrates, is that acceptable? When can it look similar? When it can look similar is when shared neutral appearance can be very helpful, and when the best case is not good enough. Pay attention to the substrate and the white point. Remember that substrates aren't perfect. There's different batches. There's also, you may have a substrate that you can buy in Europe that when you purchase it in North America is different. Imagery. In our case, sometimes we have clients who want to print an image of a white product, and you can't make the image of the product whiter than the white point of the substrate. So if your paper is very gray, you can never get the white of the image. Your ink set, you can't make your image brighter than your ink. So if your ink, you're in the case of the yellow that we were looking at a moment ago, if the yellow is too muddy to begin with, you can never hit those true kind of crisp yellows. And then finishing, when you add a laminate or coating to a print product, how does this shift the white point and the printed color? Today's companies rarely produce only print products. So how do you align web and screens with print, or vice versa? How does this apply with other substrates? So the image on the right, trade show booth. So we have large format fabric. We have vinyl that's printed and mounted to substrate. We have screens. And then we have direct print to substrate in the hallway down behind the doorway there. And so the part of this is that, the reds need to be the same red and the appearance needs to be similar. This particular instance provides additional challenges because the trade show environment, you often do not have the ability to control your lighting. And so as you can see with the two whites that are here where my cursor's on the screen, those two whites are actually the same white. It's just the light that's hitting them that's different. So in that same case, the red that we see here will look a little bit different than the red there, even though they're the same color. So understanding that and conveying that and working with expectations of clients and customers to convey that is really helpful as well. And I think one of the last things to say is that the foundation of G7 and shared neutral appearance really are a no-brainer for any company wanting to own the representation of their brand. So, thank you.
Great. So, Steve, can you transfer it over to Mike?
Okay, it's over to Mike. Thanks, Andy.
Okay.
By the way, everybody, you can ask a question at any time. Just type it in the chat box, and we'll take them at the end.
And does everybody see everything okay?
Yes, looks great.
Excellent. Okay. Well, hi, I'm Mike Todrick. I'm a color technical specialist for IWCO Direct, and I'm here to talk a little bit about shared neutral appearance and how we utilize that at our facility. So why shared neutral appearance? So a little bit about us. So IWCO Direct is the largest direct mail printer in North America. So we print, we do about 350 million pieces of mail a month, and about 150 to 175 linear digital feet of print a month. So the mail pieces that we produce integrate multiple sub-pieces, and those are always printed on a variety of different substrates on different technologies. So we may have a flexo envelope with a digitally printed letter with a card affixed to it that was printed sheet-fed on plastic, with an insert on coated paper, with another different BRE card or another kind of a card printed on an uncoated stock, and those all have to have a shared appearance. And so we have a lot of different devices that need to have that shared appearance. We have 13 different continuous web litho presses. We have 2 sheet-fed presses. We have 12 continuous web inkjet presses, soon to be 14. 10 flexo presses, 7 Epson proofers, 3 cut sheet color toner devices, and 1 cut sheet inkjet device. And so all of those different devices will be producing different pieces that will all get integrated into different mail pieces. So the necessity to be able to have a shared neutral appearance or common appearance across all of those different technologies is critical for us to be able to make this whole thing work. So therefore, we spend a lot of time working on G7 and working on things like that. So I'll go into that a little. So how do we get there? So the biggest way that we accomplish this is with G7 across all of our technologies. So we do G7 through some form on every technology that we have, from litho to flexo to digital to all the different digital technologies. So our first step was setting our press aim. So right now we run to Grackle CRPC6 coded for all of our coded stocks, and CRPC3 Grackle uncoded for all of our uncoded stocks. And we calibrate every device to match that in some way to the best of their ability. So all of our litho presses, we're doing G7 press curves in order to get them to match, and we are shooting for color space. We have now achieved G7 color space across all of our different technologies. So we're shooting for G7 color space to get the closest similar appearance that we can get across all of our technologies, and we do the same for our coded and uncoded stocks and our plastic stocks. For our digital presses, we do that through G7 curves if they can take them. Otherwise, we do that through use of G7 input profiles to calibrate everything toward G7 and toward that shared common appearance. So we also use those press aims in designing. So our own creative services department uses the CRPC6 or CRPC3 when they're doing all of their designing. So the goal is that they are seeing and proofing and sending out to our customers representations of what it's going to look like. So as Andy was talking about, if there are some discussion that has to be made on what are we going to do about this color being out of gamut or something, that can all be done knowing that what we're giving them we can hit. So it starts in designing. We've also given out a lot of the press standards out to our customers. One of the challenges that we have in regards to receiving files from the outside is that still the vast majority of what we get comes in as US web-coded swap v2 or something similar to it. So it does make it difficult in those cases to get things converted over. So as said before, by calibrating everything to CRPC6 or 3, we only have to keep one set of assets for all of our different print technologies. So we only have, that way we can move things around. Our scheduling department doesn't like to be constrained in any way when it comes to, oh, well, we have to print that on that because that's the only one that can handle the gamut or whatever. They want to be able to move everything around as freely as possible. So it's also critical, since we have multiple printers of the same type, those printers have to match each other and the other printers, especially in the digital environment, to a very, very, very tight tolerance. So it's critical for us to be able to utilize CRPC3 and CRPC6, which are G7 standards. We keep one set of assets and we can move those around fairly easily. We normalize our files with GCR because so much of our stuff does come in as swap. It usually has a skeleton black or no black at all. So we're also normalizing our files with GCR to try to help get a better shared appearance. Solid contract proofing, adjusting the white point as needed. So on our coded proofs, we proof to Grackle CRPC3 white point. We found that when we were doing our uncoded proofs that all of our offset stocks tended to have a much bluer, lots of optical brighteners, and a much bluer white point. So we have actually adjusted our proofing in contract proofing for the uncoded substrates and shifted the white points on those so we get a much better proof to press match now out on press for our uncoated proofing. We're holding most of our proofing. We also, on a weekly basis, print a TC1617 on every single one of our proofing devices and read that in and check it for accuracy. So right now we're holding about a 0.9 delta E, average delta E, every week on those printers. So we're checking them to color space and just checking to make sure that they're holding the tolerances so that every proof that goes out to the press, we want to make absolutely positive that that proof is as accurate as possible for the pressman to match to. And also for our customers, when we send out customers proofs, that the proof that they get is also, we know that it's accurate and it's going to work for them. So all litho is calibrated to G7, both coated and uncoated. So we go through and twice a year we go through and check all of our presses, every single one on coated and uncoated stocks. And for the ones that print plastic, we also do plastic. We check and make sure that they are still in spec and still printing at G7, and if not, we make whatever adjustments we have to make. Plus, they are, as part of our process control, they're checking G7 all the time on the jobs. Now, on our litho, we do the vast majority of those jobs tend to be spot colors. And so we're checking all of those and holding those to the Pantone tolerances as well. But all of our litho presses are calibrated to G7. So all of our digital devices are set to emulate Grackle 2013, either coated or uncoated, to the best of their ability. So all the input profiles for all of those different printers are all set up for Grackle 2013, coated or uncoated. So that, again, helps us to get that shared appearance with litho and also the shared appearance between the printers. Now, any digital device that can take curves, we calibrate to G7. So we do have a number of our production inkjet devices that can accept a curve, and for those, we do a G7 curve on them as part of the calibration process before we make the output profiles. This gives us a better, more solid output profile, we believe. That's more usable. That way we can share some of those output profiles for certain substrates across printers and keep them calibrated to each other through the use of the G7 curve. So right now, before we started using G7 curves across some of our digital technology, we had a match on average of about a 1.5 delta E between our production inkjet devices. We are now matching at about a 0.4 delta E between our devices, which means that as machines fill up, we can move those files and move those jobs across any of those printers and have a great amount of confidence that what prints on those printers is going to look the same. G7 is what has enabled us to be able to get that close of a match between our printers. So we have been pushing all of our different production inkjet manufacturers that we work with to incorporate or allow us to incorporate G7. Not all of them do. You can't always a lot of production inkjet rips just won't accept a G7 curve. But for the ones that we do the G7 curves, and for the ones that don't, we are constantly pushing back on the manufacturer to introduce that as part of their system. And that's about all I had, actually, in that regard.
Yep. No, it's very good, Mike. Great.
Thank you.
Yeah. So Steve, if you can flip it back over, control to me, and then we'll get into Q&A.
Thanks for the info there, Mike and Andy and Ron. Great information from multiple perspectives, from service providers and brand owner. It's really amazing what we see around the world with Idealliance. And Idealliance, for those maybe who are on this webinar and not familiar with us, we're a global nonprofit think tank, and as Ron pointed out, we have 12 offices, and we work around the world very graciously and quietly. And we work with probably the top 40 or top 50 brands in the world, and every time we start these conversations with brands, it's kind of like an intervention. The approach is very, very delicate and fragile, and we have to be very careful because they typically know things need to change, and it's on our approach that we have to be careful in order to help facilitate this change and open up the awareness for change. Because like in life, what stands in the way becomes the way, and often that barrier is our own selves and getting through that. But the only way to get through that is self-recognition of seeing that, and we can't say, hey, it's you that's the problem. It has to change. Only happens when people are at the intersection of desperation and grace, and people absolutely change, and organizations change, and things evolve, and that's why we created BrandQ, and we do a tremendous amount of custom consulting around the world. But so I appreciate the incredible perspectives from the people that shared, Mike and Andy, who I know very well, and because the insight is coming from two very different viewpoints, and I appreciate that. So the question that came in was, and anyone can field this, please, is how are brand colors, PMS, or custom spot colors handled if it is to print CMYK on an offset, flexo, and digital device? Is the artwork saved with PMS colors and converted to CMYK at the printer?
I can answer that from our end. When we get files in that are set up for spot colors, and the spot colors are brand colors, and yet it's going to print either on a digital device or has to print CMYK, we get into that scenario a lot in regards to sometimes if something's going to print litho, there's just not enough units to print everything that they want as spot colors, and then have some four-color photos or something along the same lines. What we try to do is, on our digital devices, we will often let the spot color go. We have spot tables on the devices. Some of our digital devices allow you to manipulate that spot color and kind of dial it in. And so if we can do that, we'll dial it in as close as we can to the Pantone standard and get it as close or as low as we can. We do that. If not, what we will often do as well is we will do the conversion of CMYK, which will be kind of optimized for Grackle, and then we will sometimes proof that back to the customer and let them see that ahead of time, knowing that we can hit those CMYK values then with that are on the proof. So.
Yeah, and a good way to think about it, also related to the G7 calibration part, is that if we are precise and close to the CMYK target, then we're going to be precise and close to that, color makeup. So on the test forms that I have a whole bunch of Pantone colors converted to CMYK, and on that final calibration, we compare proof to press sheet. So if the calibration is good, then the chance of you being close to that CMYK build is quite good.
Yeah, I would agree with that, absolutely.
Yeah. And that's part of that whole, the whole gray and that calibration method of getting that getting gray balance and tonality in there. brings those colors in there too as well.
So another question here is, excuse me, this one's for Mike. Why did IWCO choose to go through G7 Master qualification? I'm trying to remember. You guys have been a G7 Master qualified facility for 10 plus years. The question is, why did you choose to go that route?
I think it's been at least 5+ years. I'm not sure exactly how long I've been in here almost 4 years. My anniversary is next week. I've been a G7 expert since 2008. I think one of the reasons is because especially as digital was starting to come into the picture, for us, they realized that unless they grabbed a hold of something that was going to give them some kind of a shared appearance or something, that they were not going to be able to manage across all of these different devices and platforms. So I think that was probably a big part of it. We also do have some clients that audit us to make sure that we're G7 Master printers. They require us to be G7 Master printers. But what I like to tell people whenever I talk about G7 is we do G7, especially in the digital world, and especially doing G7 on the digital presses, even though, if you put an input profile into a digital press, the output is going to be G7. It would probably pass at least G7 grayscale or Target or something like that. So does that make you compliant? Yes. Could I turn that into Idealliance and get a certificate and maybe a sticker and a button? Yeah, I could. I do G7 on my digital presses because it gives me a much tighter match between my digital presses than I would get if I didn't use G7. So while I like to have the certificates, and that's an important part of our business, I do G7 on those kind of presses because it works. And it gives me that shared appearance and the tighter match between devices that I need to satisfy my customers.
That's a great answer. And sorry, Ron, were you going to say something?
No, that's right.
There's a question that came in. I'm trying to process it's broken up in a few different spaces here. So I'm actually trying to make sense of it. The way it broke up in the messaging. It's for Flexo in regards to flexible packaging and solvent based on flexible films and process control in Delta. And I think the question is in regards to controlling G7 on Flexo, which we obviously work a tremendous amount with around the world. Ron, you might take that question. Because Flexo and obviously a lot of people are doing flexible packaging.
Yeah. No, and it can be done, it's done for all those pouches and packets and bags and many, many other things as well. But controlling that, the first key part of that is, having a calibration that's done with G7, and then basically measurement and adjustment. So in those processes, we're going to be measuring all the time, and then we're going to be adjusting, the inks and the strength and the weakness of it, and the doctor blades and the analogs and all that. But the key to that is measuring so that the press operator knows what to adjust. So in the world of G7, once you've done that and calibrated, that's good, you're there. But to maintain that, you have to do pretty much constant measurement and process control. So you're going to be running your equipment, measuring it. Press operator is going to look at where the color needs to go, and they're going to make that adjustment and return it to that G7 condition. Without a target, there's no way to get anywhere. So the whole key part of it, and probably one of the most valuable parts of it, is having an aim that's easy to follow and that your operators can go back to.
Okay, great. Andy, the question for you and your work with brands around the world, and which varies in regards to you're bouncing around America, Europe, and Asia Pacific. I know that with the supply chains that you work with, and this is the question is, of getting the supply chains that G7 certified, how important is that for you with the brands that you work with?
At this point, it's something that, well, one of the companies that I work with, we suggest it, we don't require it. But the way that we're targeting, we've set up a set of communication documents that are based on some of the things that Ron teaches in his classes, is that, we, by giving clear direction from what we expect from the print supply chain, we hope to get better results back. And a lot of what we're directing the supply chain to do is to meet G7 requirements. We don't require them to actually be G7, but because we're holding them to the same measurement standards, which are all based on ISO standards, it's become quite important. There is places where there's, conflict. It's harder to get G7 made in Europe still than it should be, but that's improving. And a lot of times with China, and in particular in Vietnam and Korea, it's pretty easy to get G7 done there. And what I've found in particular has been interesting is how quickly those particular supply chains in Asia, when we said we want G7, they said, oh, great, we know how to do it. Here you go. And the turnaround has been fantastic and quick. And it's helped reinforce that it's important and we want to pursue it elsewhere in the world.
Yeah, we're delighted in Europe that we have our 6th training coming up next week in Barcelona for the year. So things are moving over there. And here's a question: can brand neutrality work with EG, expanding gamut print solutions, or is it only for CMYK only?
What was the first part of that question, Tim?
Can brand neutrality? I think he meant near neutral.
Oh, shared neutral appearance.
Yeah.
It's okay. So it works for the, if you look at ECG, 4 of the 7 channels are usually CMYK. So that would be, shared neutral appearance working there. And then we're using SCTV, which is another calibration method that came out of Print Properties for the OGV. So there is some shared neutral appearance, and Idealliance has a Print Properties project working on a data set to do something similar, although shared neutral appearance for the single channel spot colors is not quite there because SCTV is tonality, which is going to help quite a bit, but it doesn't actually control the interaction of the 3 inks.
Can you, there's another question that it's not the same thing, but you can stay on because it's a question for you, is can you explain just quickly, because there's a number of questions here, the difference in calibrating the press for G7 compared to traditional fingerprinting for ICC profiling? And Mike, you could certainly answer this too, and Andy probably too.
Yeah, so I'll do a quickie, but calibrating a press is where we're basically lining up the colors of the inks. So we're getting the ink to be the right color. And then instead of doing dot gain like you used to do, we're basically getting tonality and grade balance, those 2 components I talked about. So on a press, if we get tonality, grade balance, and ink the right color, we end up hitting these standard print conditions like Grackle. On a digital press, we're still trying to make sure that device has a large enough gamut, but at that point, we use the math of profiling instead of plate curves to get there. So I'll let Mike give his explanation of it, but that's kind of the way that I look at it is, some of it is shared, but that final result of G7 is what we're looking for in both of them.
Yeah, so I've done traditional fingerprinting and ICC profiling of an individual press. In my past life, we did G7 for die sub. So in the beginning, before G7, we just had to make a press profile of our press, and get it as good as we can, kind of to the densities the guys like to run at, and just kind of go for it. The beauty of doing G7 comparatively is, like Ron just said, if you get the inks the right color and you're calibrating to G7, you are now hitting CRPC6 or CRPC3. I don't have to try to profile a press, which can be extremely difficult, and that profile is only good for a month or so, and then it's off a little bit. By using G7, I don't have to go through the pain of profiling the press. Also, by using G7, if I were to profile each of the individual presses and I needed a file moved, I couldn't just move the plates from one press to the other. I would have to replate it, because I would have to reseparate it, because I would have to do it for whatever press that was. Now, if I'm doing everything to Grackle coated, I can just move to all the presses that are calibrated for Grackle coated, and I'll be okay.
Yep.
Great, thanks. Andy, I throw this question to you. What is the recommended profile for graphic designers when preparing graphic files such as Photoshop?
Oh boy.
Yeah. So that's
US web coded swap.
Yeah, not the default of what Adobe loads for you. I think just one of the things that we talk about frequently, and it's often you buy Photoshop, you buy Adobe Creative Suite, you open it, and you start working. And the reality is what's loaded by Adobe as the default is something that shouldn't be used by anybody. And it's outdated. It's not appropriate. And so part of what the point of my spiel, and probably not as clearly defined, is that you need to understand what your target is. So if you're working with a printer or printers that typically are printing to CRPC6 or Grackle 2013, that's what it should be. If in the case of one of our clients, they're working towards Grackle 2006 coded 1V2, that should be your profile. To be safe, it's best to ask, but know that a Grackle profile by default is probably going to be more stable and give you better results than any of the swap profiles, any of the other things that come generically loaded. I will also say that make sure to download the correct Grackle profiles from either the Idealliance website or color.org, because these have been tuned and refined versus the ones that come by default in Adobe.
Mm-hmm.
Great answer.
What? And we also, for us, we make available to our clients, if they want them, we'll send those out with instructions on how to install them into the Creative Suite, right, and how to use the CRPC 3 or 6, depending on what they're doing. So. Yeah,
and that's probably the best thing, is that if you're working with somebody that's helping you with color, ask them what their recommendation is. But if you don't have that, the default is go load the two that are available. So.
Yep.
We have one last question here, and it's how effective is SCTV for predicting tone results when printing spot colors? And if people don't know what SCTV is, it's ISO 20654, which is spot color tone value, which was actually born out of Idealliance Print Properties and Colorimetric Council. So anyone can take that one?
I would say the key thing to remember about that is SCTV predicts the spot color tonality, which is the weight, which is actually a big deal, but it doesn't predict the color. That's another thing that's on our list that is on there, and we haven't moved that deeply into it, but it's a big deal because it predicts the tonality, but it does not predict the color. So it's going to give you the weight, but it will not give you the color of the spot color.
The one thing I'll say on that, Ron, is that I've been working with a company we're actually going through this process with, the SCTV process, to try to achieve a couple of unique printing conditions. And I've been surprised by how well it has reproduced the color. A part of that is the diligence that the company is doing with maintaining the calibrations of their presses, doing the G7, et cetera. But it's been amazing how close it's been. They're really great results.
Yeah. One, I would think it would have something to do, too, with the how well the spot ink is made and that they're using good pigments and in the right proportions and things like that would help too, so that it tints down similarly. Yeah.
And that was the other piece that was really important to that, was simplifying the pigment builds for the ink, so that there was less interactions with things that might make things more muddy. So very, very good point.
That's all the questions for today, and that's all the time we have for today. And I thank Mike and Andy and always Ron for sharing and taking control of all these meetings, and for everyone out there who chimes in and listens to these BrandQ webinars all over the world. I hope everybody has a wonderful weekend.
Yeah, great. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. No, not a problem. Thank you.